How old does a game need to be to feel retro? Certainly you'd think more than the 5 years between Hard Reset being released on PC and its Redux edition released last week on various formats. Here we're looking at the Xbox One version. But there is a strong feeling of old school shooter in there, even where it avoids the usual retro stylings of pixel art and chiptune soundtracks. Its presentation is very much up to date, but the design feels like it harks back to Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, for better and for worse. It's obviously a first-person shooter, blasting away at various types of robot as they try to rip you apart. You carry the same two guns from the outset, which sounds limiting, though both of them get upgraded to have multiple firing modes. Your basic assault rifle can also be used as a shotgun, a rocket launcher, a trip mine thrower and so on, all using the same ammo pool and cycled through quickly to let you adapt mid-combat. Similarly, the plasma gun can do things like arc electricity or function as a railgun, which I admit to finding very satisfying. These upgrades are earned during gameplay. Destroying robots awards an XP equivalent in the form of nanites, with larger amounts given for larger enemies, and you'll also find blocks fit on the floor as you progress through the levels. When the upgrade bar is filled, you can use the special terminals to add an extra feature to your gun or suit. It's not a foolproof interface, but it does add a lot to the game's atmosphere by keeping it in-game rather than abstracted to a menu screen. I should also mention the game does have a katana for melee combat, which you'll pick up fairly early on, used for as long as the novelty takes to wear off, and then never go back to. Flying Wild Hog did well with their update of Shadow Warrior, making a game that has surprisingly good first-person melee combat. But this game is not Shadow Warrior, and was never intended to have close-range combat nearer than the barrel of a shotgun. The katana is such a clumsy addition to the game, nowhere near balanced for use, that its inclusion feels pointless at best. When I got my hands on it, I wanted it to be awesome. Such a shame. All guns are hip-fired. There are no iron sights to use. Instead you rely on a target circle and the trust you'll hit whatever enemies are in it. There are also no magazine reloads, so for as long as you have ammunition you can keep firing, although thankfully this regenerates at low levels and drops pretty freely from enemies, as do small health pickups. There's no crouching and no real need for cover. Generally your survival comes from dashing away from hazards and hitting enemies with high amounts of damage. After years of playing games like Call of Duty or Battlefield with reloads and cover and finer levels of aiming, going back to a run and gun style of playing had a small learning curve, but you do start feeling pretty powerful as it all comes together. The game's press releases covered the plot as being about defending the last human city, Bazoa, from machines threatening the extinction of humanity, and I'll admit my thoughts immediately compared this to the Matrix sequels. But this is not especially accurate, as the game's plot plays out very differently. The city carries more of a Blade Runner feel, with plenty of neon, advertising terminals and artificial lighting to set the atmosphere. The stories progress between levels using animated comic panels, complete with speech bubbles, and this presentation is a highlight of the overall narrative, because while the story may start with the need to defend the city, it quickly starts throwing in plot twists, agents going rogue, villains with benevolent motivation, that kind of thing. This might sound welcome, but it becomes convoluted quickly, and before long it just feels incoherent, people saying things to explain why we're going somewhere next.
Major, the booze can wait. Check Sector 6.
Overtime? Again?
And going somewhere next also summarises a lot of the mission objectives. Progression through the levels is pretty linear, usually wanting you to travel from A to B with complications en route sending you via C. You'll have plenty to shoot at keeping you entertained, but there's little additional motivation from the story, especially when all it takes is walking into a certain doorway or arriving in an area to end a level. I'm not suggesting the player should influence the direction of the plot, but when the plot could be completely detached from the gameplay with little consequence, it doesn't feel right at all. I will admit to feeling some of the levels would benefit from some form of marker or waypoint. When you're being told to head to a certain location, your usual method of finding the path is to keep following the flow of robots attacking you. But this isn't foolproof, with a couple of levels turning back on themselves, and some having paths branch off towards secret areas, and if you get turned around you generally only know you're back on the right path when the game pauses to load the next section. And this is also worth noting, entering a new area is usually met with a half-second pause for loading purposes, which feels strange in a modern game. It stands out and breaks the atmosphere, but thankfully you won't meet this while you're fighting to break your general flow. While we're picking on some of the less ideal parts of the design, the level difficulties can be inconsistent. Perhaps the most common examples when facing the early encountered, small, common and most annoyingly exploding robots in a confined space, which can often result in more deaths than the large boss fights. There are a couple of points where the level design seem to emphasise this. And this leads to the strange situation where some of the later levels feel easier than earlier ones, just due to the enemy selection. And it's a comparatively small selection, though I wouldn't call this a fault personally. Quick recognition of what's fighting you feels natural when you're also expected to be dashing around combat and changing weapons types on the fly. These are things that also play in favour of the game's survival mode. You just choose one of 4 arenas to fight off increasing waves of robots in. Guns in hand, enemy types the same as the main game, no loading screens or confused routes to navigate. You also earn an equipment upgrade every wave, which ironically means the first wave being one of the hardest, but lets you quickly throw together your preferred build. The game has no multiplayer, but you can indirectly compete thanks to your efforts being recorded on leaderboards. Hard Reset Redux definitely feels like it's been shaped with an old game mould. The approach of run and gun overkill contrasts with the more cover-based military shooters of recent years, and the 2-weapon mechanic is well realised, letting you quickly cycle to the tool for the job mid-fight. But I do wish that some parts of the game were better realised. The story tries too hard for something clever and is left with something incomprehensible. The difficulty of the levels can be inconsistent, and the katana feels like it's been added just to let Flying Wild Hog remind us they also did Shadow Warrior. It's a fun game, enjoyable despite the flaws which sadly sit in places that can be hard to ignore.